in this chapter, we start to look at oligopolies and monopolistic competition. It's somewhat standard, and I'm not sure I entirely agree with the philosophy, but it is what it is. But the idea is, so right, this is the third chapter where we're kind of looking at this kind of continuum here. And on the one end, we had the perfect competition, where these firms were price takers who had no power, no market power. And then just in the last chapter, we looked at monopolies. And these were price makers who had total power. And so now we're kind of looking at this middle space, but unfortunately, we're putting it all in one chapter. Oligopolies being right here. And monopolistically competitive firms being right here. And as you can see on this continuum of market power, monopolistically competitive firms have a little bit of pricing power. Oligopolistic firms have even a little bit more power than that. And although we do encounter monopolies, obviously, in our everyday lives, we do much more frequently encounter monopolistically competitive and oligopolistic firms. Okay, so let's look at their definitions here. So usually with an oligopoly, we have anywhere between 5 to 8 firms, and these 5 to 8 firms are able to stay as a small number because they've created some substantial barriers to entry. It could be something as sinister and explicit as a cartel, where the 5 to 8 firms do what they have to do and coordinate with each other to ensure that no one else enters or exits without their permission. We would see that with something like OPEC or something like that. Or the oligopoly takes a little bit of an informal creation, right? If we look at something, for instance, like the airlines, they, what is it, the largest 4 airlines in the United States control something like 80% of the market. They do that not through a cartel where there's explicit coordination, but rather they do it by controlling, the supply of pilots, by controlling airplane orders, by controlling pricing at different airports, such that they've created such a strong airline and such a strong network that it would be foolish for someone to try to start their own airline. Now, it's also going to be true with an oligopoly, as we'll see in this chapter. It's also true that an oligopoly dies a very, very slow death if it's dying at all. Because the pricing can be set such that the firm can still overcharge or be one of the few suppliers of the product. And it's relatively true. Airlines don't generally go bankrupt and go out of business. Most of the time, what happens is they get bought out by someone else before they're going to fail. And here in Hawaii, we would know this rather well, that Hawaiian Airlines got bought out by Alaska Airlines. And it got bought out because otherwise, if it had been more competitive, it just would have failed. But it didn't go bankrupt. It got bought out by someone else. And then we have our monopolistically competitive firms. These are firms where the barriers to entry and exit are much lower. And what that means is that the firms have a little bit less market power than if they were oligopolistic. And they sell goods that have relatively close substitutes, meaning that that the goods are not rather inelastic, that the competition is such that firms are not going to firms actively compete with others to sell the same product. Obviously, this is the kind of competition that we encounter a great deal, right? If I want to buy pencils, I probably have a choice of 10, 15 different manufacturers. Now, there's a big manufacturer out there, right? Ticonderoga. But then there's a flurry of others. If I want to buy a calculator, certainly we could have a firm like Texas Instruments that makes a lot of calculators. But we know that I could buy, if I went to the store, there's going to be other calculator companies out there as well. And they're not really doing anything proprietary. The calculator I buy isn't going to give me different results based on who I buy it from. And so, what monopolistically competitive firms have to do is they have to spend a lot of money on marketing, or they have to spend a lot of money creating some advantage or incentive. So the question would be is then, well, how does Texas Instrument do it, right? How do they get their calculators to be so much more trusted than a calculator from HP or from Casio or something like that? Well, they spend a lot of money on grade schools and high schools getting their calculators in the door. They spend money getting the teachers at high schools and at grade schools to encourage their students to buy Texas Instrument calculators. They make buddies with the people at the ETS and AP, SAT exams to get their calculators accepted. And then by the time you're in college, you're like, dude, I'm just going to keep using the same kind of calculator I've always been able to use. And there you go. Now, again, you try to do things that give you some market power, like Apple does in its competition with Android, right? By having like the blue circles for messages rather than green. But at some point, right, you've got to rely on other things to get your products used and purchased. So as we've and if we go back to the very first slide where I wrote out that continuum, again, when we're defining things like perfect competition, monopolistic competition, oligopolies, and monopolies, they're going to differ based on these four things. Not perfectly competitive firms have lots of competitors. Easy entry exit. I know this is going to be somewhat review. And that the firms do not differentiate. Product is not differentiated. So that was from 2 chapters ago. And then if we look at our last chapter here, monopolies have no competitors, no entry exit, and the product is unique because they are the only providers of it. In oligopolies, I'm going to call this kind of controlled competition. It's controlled because there are so few competitors. And here there's little to no entry exit. And here, product may be differentiated or not. We don't really, it can go both ways. Within monopolistic competition, there's also lots of competition. It's not difficult, so it's not easy, but it's not difficult. So there's some barriers to entry or exit, but they're very far and few between. I'm going to say here that you have to advertise your differences. You really might not have really any differences in your product between them, but you really have to show quite strongly why your product is different, whether that's in fact true or not. And there you go. That's a much nicer way of putting it. Um, Scheiding and Perloff think alike here. Um, but what I just said is no different than what we have here. It just looks fancier. So OPEC is, again, a rather famous example of a cartel. Essentially, what you have are the countries where massive oil production is occurring meet in Vienna several times a year, and they make agreements about how much oil they're going to sell. And they do this so that their activities are coordinated with one another. The United States is not part of OPEC. The only thing that the U.S. is obviously not happy having OPEC exist, because what it means is that prices are kept a bit higher. But then the United States, about 10 years ago, started producing a lot more oil by fracking. It's like drilling horizontally and in different ways, such that we actually made enough oil to be able to actually export it ourselves, which then reduced the power that OPEC had. The United States has a lot of natural gas. We tried to create a cartel of countries that produce natural gas, but it didn't really go anywhere, because it turns out that natural gas is harder to distribute across country borders than oil is. And so, what you see here is that if we had perfect competition, we would kind of have a normally shaped marginal cost curve, and we'd have a marginal revenue curve that looks a lot like the demand curve. But what happens with the cartel is that um, we have that imposed restriction on how much is going to be produced. And so what it does is it creates a situation where now the price is kept artificially higher. Right, so we already knew with monopolies that the price was going to be higher than it was in competition. So all that we're going to do as a cartel is we're going to limit the quantity produced to QM to act such that we can charge prices as if we were a monopolist, even though there's more than one firm that exists. Now, two things can happen that have that create the current situation that we have right now. Cartels can fail, and they sometimes do, if non-cartel members can supply consumers with the product. So, for instance, with the case of OPEC, as I just had mentioned, OPEC has gotten weaker over the past decade or so than it was, for instance, in the 1970s and 1980s, because the United States has been rather successful at producing more oil. But still, OPEC exists. Or alternatively, each member of the cartel has an incentive to cheat or do something different than what they promised, according to the cartel agreement. So, in the case of OPEC, each country says we're only going to produce a certain amount, let's say whatever millions of barrels of oil. Yet, Saudi Arabia is well known as a member of the cartel that routinely cheats that agreement and produces more than it should. Now, what that means is that it weakens the cartel, because now you know Saudi Arabia is a cheater. So there probably is some backward, backroom, um, uh, you know, hush hush conversations about, you know, Saudi Arabia cheating and how are we going to exist in a situation where they're allowed to cheat. Somehow it's been worked out because OPEC still exists, yet everyone knows that Saudi Arabia cheats. We have sort of a mixed history of these cartels. We used to have them quite a bit, and we had these with oil, that would be Standard Oil. We had it with railroads, that would be what Vanderbilt had created with the railroad system. We had it in sugar. We even had it in tobacco. Yet, what happened, in the Sherman Antitrust Act and later with the FTC in 1914. So, all this is largely under the Theodore Roosevelt administration. Firms were prohibited from taking actions where they could take actions to reduce competition. There's kind of a famous story that kind of goes around that in the 1980s, um, you had two rather large airlines that had national operations, and a large set of their operations were out of Texas. That'd be American Airlines, which still exists today, and Continental Airlines, which eventually merged with United. And the CEO of American Airlines called up the CEO of Continental Airlines and said, in not so many words, and it was a recorded call, so we do know exactly what was said. I just don't remember it. But essentially, what was said is American told Continental, raise your prices by 10%, and then we'll raise ours by 10% the very next day. Um, and it got out that that was said, and I don't think the CEO was thrown in jail, but he probably had to pay a big fine for violating the FTC. Now, as a test of this, though, right? So I'm getting ready to book a flight. I was getting ready to book a flight from Duke to my hometown of Milwaukee. And I was going to do this trip. I was just booking a one-way flight, and I was doing this for May 10th. So this is just a real-world test here, and what we're seeing here is, I don't know, prices that are relatively the same across lots of different airlines, right? American, United, Delta, those are the big ones. Yeah, you have your outliers here like JetBlue, but for otherwise, it looks like the price is basically between 200 and 250 in a pretty narrow range. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean we have a cartel here? Not really, because it's not a cartel in the formal sense where one airline is setting the price and then the others are required to follow that price. Rather, they all have access to the pricing system. It's a database. They're not going on Expedia or Google Flights and finding out what their competitors are charging. They have access to the same databases that they all do, and they're all going in there and they're saying, okay, so and so is raising their price by $20. We're going to do the same, right? Or they're saying, the competitor raised his price by $20. I'm going to really fill up my plane and just keep charging the lower price, right? So there's usually like a low price guy out there, right? In this case, it looks like American trying to fill up its last flight of the day and charging $103, right? And they're not really, they need to get looks like in this case, they need to get the plane back to its final destinations, right? To start up the next day. So they're just trying to fill up a flight that, is leaving in about a month here. Otherwise, everyone else is charging the same prices. They could lower the prices if they want to, but there seems to be some consistency here. Again, not really a cartel, just highly coordinated activities going on here. And so we don't have a lot of examples of them. We truly don't. We don't have a lot of examples of cartels, but we do have some. And the reason why they continue to exist is because cartels aren't illegal everywhere. We also have cartels because, um, generally speaking, the punishments are not very significant. So I'm sure it's also true that, right, let's just be realists. Airlines do talk, I'm sure airlines do talk to each other and they do try to coordinate some things. They just can't be explicit about it, or that they can't, um, be as dumb as the guy from the CEO of American, where they specifically say what they're going to do. And that's what we get with the last sub bullet point here, is that firms are coordinating their activity without formally meeting. If they're all looking at the same pricing database and they all have the same, and they coordinate their prices that way, then they're not really violating any laws. And, they're kind of free to do that. There's no law against looking at the same pricing database. So, yes, we have examples of cartels existing, yet um, they're expensive also to maintain, because you have to keep your cartel hidden from customers and other government agencies, and you have to have a system set up where, among your few companies that, your few companies, or in the case of OPEC, your few countries that exist, you have to find out a way to detect those who are cheating and punish those who are cheating. Um, Not always easy to do. And there's obviously, again, a high incentive to cheat and to punish. Um, but what are you going to do? You're going to stop Saudi Arabia from pumping out oil. And so if they're violating the agreement, the best you can do is just try to control what they're doing. Let's go back to the airlines here, because, again, it is a pretty good example of what is kind of going on here. The other thing we could do is we can set up our laws, our legal system, such that mergers can't happen. So this is what we're trying to do with airlines. Alaska Airlines was able to buy Hawaiian, and before that, they had bought the airline Virgin America. Um, but on the other hand, JetBlue wasn't allowed to buy Spirit Airlines. And we don't even really know if Alaska Airlines is ultimately going to be allowed to um, buy Hawaiian. The Justice Department could turn it down. And, why would the U.S. do it? It's not trying to, like, put Hawaiian Airlines out of business. At the same time, it doesn't want to create a situation where the airlines get so big that they do have monopolistic power. So it is, over the past 20 years, airlines have merged. American Airlines bought U.S. Airways. It was Continental that, technically speaking, had bought United. Delta had bought Northwest Airlines. Southwest Airlines bought AirTran. So in my discussion there, I just listed the four airlines. The way they got bigger was by buying other airlines that were failing. But those airlines are now so big, they're not going to be allowed to get any larger. They'll just have to get larger by becoming, just by growing their own business, which you can't really stop that from happening. Now, I love talking about these because, outside of a cartel, where you're specifically, with an agreement of some kind limiting what companies do, we still, as economists, want to have some way to talk about what firms are going to do, how they're going to compete with one another. And so we have three models to describe their behavior. We have the Cournot model, the Stackelberg model, and the Bertrand model. So let's look at each of these three. In a Cournot oligopoly, you have four conditions existing. And you need to kind of start, although we look at it more in the next chapter, this is going to be kind of our first introduction to thinking about things in a game theory mindset. So we have a duopoly here. That would mean we have an oligopoly with just two firms that are competing with each other. Now, let's presume that these two firms are exactly identical. They have the same cost functions, and that the product they produce is undifferentiated, exact same product. So, if both firms act simultaneously, meaning that they set the price at the exact same time, then the question would be we would be curious as to what the result's going to be. So each firm is going to act simultaneously, and each firm is going to choose either its quantity or its price, and they're only going to choose it once. So they make that decision at the beginning of the time period. What we see in the Cournot oligopoly is that the firms are going to end up at the Nash equilibrium, which, again, we'll talk about much more in chapter 14 in the next chapter. But what that means is, as a Nash equilibrium, that it's a non-cooperative. Right, so these two firms in this duopoly are going to be non-cooperative. And we'll say that it's maximizing profit, knowing that the other firm is doing the same. And so that's going to then impact both the pricing decision as well as the quantity decision. So sometimes it's called the Nash-Cournot equilibrium. Otherwise, you can just call it the Cournot equilibrium. They're both the same thing. And what we see with any equilibrium is we start to see things settle down to a certain either quantity or a certain price. And it dictates for us, for instance, if we're talking about a route, for instance, between Chicago and Los Angeles that both American and United serve quite extensively. These firms are not going to be in a cartel where they're explicitly agreeing how many seats to sell, but knowing each airline, knowing what the other airline is going to do, and that they're trying to maximize their profit, they're going to behave in a way where simultaneously both American and United are going to settle on an equilibrium that maximizes their profit with knowledge that the other firm is doing the same. Now, how does that look? Well, had it been just a monopoly, it'd be easy to see what's going to go on here. If it was just a monopoly, single price monopolist, they would set MR equal to MC and then go up to the demand curve to find the price. Instead, what we see here is that the under the duopoly is that, in this case, for just American, it's not going to set its MR. It's still going to set its MR equal to its MC, but the demand itself is now restricted. The demand is restricted because essentially what we're trying to do here is recognize how much of the market, what the total market is, and how much of that piece of the total pie I'm going to be able to capture as an individual airline. So each firm in the duopoly will set MR equal to MC, as we would expect. But they also know that the other firm is doing the same. And what that requires us to then solve for is a best response curve. Or we could call these, in other parts of the literature, we would call these reaction curves. I'm not really entirely sure why Parloff wants to call them best response curves, but it is what it is. But what it does is it shows you if what each firm will do. That, for instance, if United offers this many seats, this is how many seats that American will offer, and so on and so forth. So we have United's reaction curve or best response curve, American's reaction curve, and again, where we settle is where these two curves cross. Because what we would see here for the equilibrium, what we would see here is a situation where if a firm is flooding the market with too many seats, then they're charging too little. If the other airline is not offering a lot of seats, their costs are going to be lower, and they're going to see that they could also they potentially have a lot more to lose. They might even undercut me on price because they just want to sell the existing seats that I have. So let's start to look at an example of this. So here's just the entire market demand curve for a certain flight. Okay, so this is just set up. It's just a standard demand curve. And then again, we're going to presume that they have the same marginal cost and average cost. Let's just say it's right. So there's no differentiations in the product itself. And then what we're going to do is you split that Q into Q1 plus Q2, or right, Q American plus Q United, such that they set it up here. Now, what we need to do is find QA in terms of everything QB. We need to find QB in terms of everything QA, meaning that, sorry, not A, sorry, not B, United, and United. It's meaning that I want to be, if I'm American Airlines, I want to determine how much I'm going to produce given what United Airlines is producing. And if I'm United Airlines, I want to figure out what I'm going to produce given what American Airlines is producing. Meaning that what we can do, let's go back here. Right, so all that I need to do here then is just rewrite the terms here. And then, with these rewritten demand curves, now I can find the marginal revenue, where the marginal revenue is going to be twice as steep. And what we're going to see here, right, is that if I rewrite these terms now, and if I rewrite the American Airlines demand curve and the United Airlines demand curve, and I rewrite them as inverse functions, that alternatively we could have done here, sorry, right here, is that we could have had P equals 339 minus QA minus QU, right? Or just rearrange the terms here. Which then, if we want to find the marginal revenue function, for instance, for firm A, it's going to be twice as steep as this. So that marginal revenue, sorry, this would be the overall marginal revenue function. That marginal revenue for firm A or American would be 339 minus 2QA minus QU. And that the marginal revenue for United Airlines would be 339 minus QA minus 2QU. Which then we are going to solve for QA and QU. Right, so I'm going to take each of these functions here, and I'm going to solve for QA and QU. So, right, now I have 339 minus 2QA minus QU. And as we solve this here, it equals the marginal cost. The marginal revenue equals the marginal cost for each firm. So now I take my marginal revenue function and I set it equal to my marginal cost. And I solve for QA. And we'll see this certainly in the problem set, but we'll also see it in the problems for this chapter. And we would solve this for both functions, for both American as well as United. You don't really see any difference here. The reason why American Airlines and United Airlines have rather similar, same structure set up for their response functions or their reaction functions is because they face the same marginal costs. If they didn't face the same marginal costs, then the reaction functions would look a little bit different. Sorry, I keep using reaction functions. It's just the way I was taught, and it's the way I've practiced it. I'm not really sure when the discipline moved over to using best response function, but it did. And so I'm sorry, they're synonyms. So if you hear me say reaction function, it also means response function. Now, just like a good algebra person, now we have two unknowns. Well, that's a problem, right? And we need to remove one of the unknowns. And we will by substituting for QU the response function. So now I'm going to substitute I'm going to substitute the QU response function into the QA response function. And that's what I'm going to do right here. And then I'll just solve for QA. And what that does is it allows me first to solve for the total quantity. But then from that quantity, I can put that back into the original price, the original demand function, to find the price. Okay. So when we start to look at these firms and how they're then behaving with each other, to rewrite how these firms in a Cournot model would compete with each other, what we have then is that the marginal revenue is equal to the price as a determined by the number of firms that exist. So in this case, we have just two firms that exist. But the idea here would be is that the as the number of firms go up, then each firm is going to get a smaller share of the market. And alternatively, what we would see is that as we get more firms, as n goes up, it can go up enough such that even if the firm is has some pricing power, that pricing power is going to be eliminated by the fact that the market share is so small. And essentially, those kind of conclusions then about how the size of the market influences things. You see that discussion basically right here. Is that if there's just a single firm, then that firm has greater inelasticity. And if the n grows very large, then what we see is greater elasticity, such that the firm ultimately can have so little power that they're just price takers. If you remember that discussion, or if you kind of, that makes somewhat sense to you, remember we talked about this in the previous chapter by talking about this in terms of the Lerner index. And so we see a Lerner index as well that we can calculate for these Cournot firms. Again, what it's determining, if you remember from the last chapter, it's determining that differential between the price and the marginal cost, where the firm is able to charge a greater difference between the price and the marginal cost to the extent that it has some inelasticity for the product. As you see here with the setup of the structure, it's not really any different except now from the monopolies, except now that we're introducing the idea that the firms, number of firms can increase beyond one. In the previous chapter, there was n was implied to be one. Now it doesn't have to be just one. It can grow. And that you could set this up for yourself. This chart just proves, though, what I just said. That as the number of firms increases from 1 to 100, that in terms of the residual demand, how much of a share of the market the firms have, what we see is that the firms get a much smaller share. And that the Lerner index, which again is capturing this, how much of a price can I charge that's beyond, how much of a price can I charge that's beyond my marginal cost, goes down. And as a result, the price goes down. Gets pretty darn close to the marginal cost, which in this case, if you remember back to that problem, was back to 147, I think, was the marginal cost. And this price is pretty darn close to that. Now, the question would be is, what if the firms do not have the same marginal cost? We started out with a simple example where they each face the same marginal cost of 147. As we change each firm's marginal cost, if they experience different ones, then what would happen is that the response functions will be different because we're still following the same rule. We're still following the same rule where the marginal revenue for each firm is equal to its marginal cost. It's just that now that they face different marginal costs, we'll get different reaction functions. And what we'll generally see is that firms that face lower costs end up producing more. And as long as the products are not differentiated from each other, they'll still charge the same price, but again, the quantity will be different based on their general costs of production. And we'll see this. This will come out even more so in the problem set. Okay, so I guess if anything to highlight this, the reality of the way that airlines compete with each other is that right, some of them have unionized flight attendants and some of them do not. Some of them fly really old planes and some of them do not. And the result is that their marginal costs are different. So even though they could face the same marginal revenue curve, what you would see is that they still go up to the demand curve to find the price. Except now, based on the marginal costs, the one that has a lower marginal cost here, in this case MC2, this firm will end up producing more than the one that's a higher cost firm. And we still set the reaction functions equal to each other, or again, the best response functions. We still set those equal to each other, except now, where American still faces a marginal cost of 147, and United now faces a marginal cost of 99. We see the exact same thing happening. Now, United produces more, and American now produces less. Whereas before they equally split the market 64-64. And again, since the product is undifferentiated, the price will be the same. It'll just be that one firm captures more of the market. And so what we could do is we could, again, solve this differently. If, for instance, United could get its marginal cost to fall because it's receiving a subsidy from the government, then we could just resolve the exact same problem again. And we could kind of go through these steps here. But again, we're going to do this in the problem set. We also see this with chip production. More specifically, we see a duopoly that we have for chips where Intel and AMD are, for the most part, the firms that produce the bulk of CPUs, or basically the things in the computer that make it do its job. I'm just looking at my computer here as I'm making this lecture here, and mine's got the Intel Pentium inside of it, according to the sticker. And I guess now I just am reading this here. It proves the second sentence here, which it's supposed to Intel inside is supposed to convince me that it's better than the AMD one. Dude, I couldn't tell you whether that's true or not. I have no idea. But let's look at the structure here. The structure would be is that if I give you the inverse demand functions and that they look a little bit different because I've now done something to differentiate their products from each other, it doesn't matter. I still do the same process of where I set a marginal revenue equal to marginal cost and then substitute my response functions or best reaction functions into each other to solve things. So same steps as we have right here. Again, I'm keeping this, again, the problem solving, I'm pushing that to the other lectures on just problem solving, just to keep the chapter lectures in a somewhat reasonable length of time. Now, in the Cournot model, what was defining them was the fact that each of them was determining their output at the exact same time. What if instead, though, firms were setting their outputs one before the other, meaning that we had a first mover? This is what we'd call the Stackelberg oligopoly. So firms are now going to have one output making its decision first. And then in terms of game theory, which again we look at in the next chapter, now the quantity of the other firm isn't the reaction function. It's actually a number because we know what it is. They moved first. And so now what we see here is that basically the first firm that moves makes its decision first. And the other airline in this case is just going to take whatever's left over. In this case here, if American Airlines is now our leader or our first mover, in other words, there's a Stackelberg leader, then essentially what we're going to do is American Airlines is going to substitute in the reaction function, but United Airlines, as the follower, is going to put the quantity directly into its reaction function. And that's what we see right here. We still have to follow the same steps of turning their demand functions into inverses. And then each of them are going to be determining their output by setting marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. So again, no differences. But what we're seeing here is that, again, we're looking at residuals. In this case, United is going to be solving its function based on what American Airlines has already decided that it's going to do. With each of these firms moving simultaneously, it doesn't have to, as a follower, it doesn't have to worry about other firms doing something other than what they said, because it's already been decided. So this is why this slide even is entitled "Why Moving Sequentially is Essential," because it's already committed to the fact of whatever number it is. When these firms are moving simultaneously, if the game is played only one time, then you could always retaliate if a firm undercut you or did something other than what it promised to do. If we've got a Stackelberg leader and the other firm doesn't do what it said it was going to do, then it's just going to produce the Stackelberg follower amount. Now, instead of being Cournot, or instead of being Stackelberg, what if they colluded? Right? What if there was no law, or they broke the law, and United and American just called each other up and just said, dude, we're killing each other on profits here. We're killing each other on prices. Let's just figure it out. What could we each do to make each of us better off collectively? And so then, well, we'll get back to this slide here, but let's go back over here. Essentially, what we would do is that instead of the Cournot equilibrium, where the two reaction functions are set equal to each other, or instead of the Stackelberg equilibrium, where the firm that faces lower cost captures more of the market than the other, instead, what we're going to look at is what's called the contract curve. And in the contract curve, we're going to be looking at joint profits. And notice what they do here. They both collectively agree to restrict their output in order to charge higher prices. Now, what's cool about looking at this chart here is that what we can see is that the firms are, if they are price takers, meaning that they are perfectly competitive, they are producing the most and charging the least collectively. And under a Cournot equilibrium, they are producing less, but the firms are charging a price that's only somewhat lower. Under Stackelberg, we have a little bit more. We have a little bit more price flexibility between the two firms, but the total output is basically the same. But it's under a cartel where even though we don't have more than one firm, we do see greater restriction in the output, and as a result, higher prices. And then if we just go back that slide, that's what we're seeing here. That under collusion, we have the highest prices and the lowest output. But looking at this here, right, and obviously we see that the profits are highest for collusion, and that the consumer surplus is the lowest. So you can see here then some sense of why the government regulates certain things in certain ways. Obviously, the government doesn't restrict competition, but it's also probably not going to be too upset with um, Stackelberg duopolies or Stackelberg levels of competition, because essentially um, the price is a little bit higher and the output's a little bit lower, but there's in some sense a healthy enough amount of profit such that these firms are going to be able to continue to exist. Right? The problem with competition is that if the long run profit is zero, these firms are going to go out of business. So, in some sense, airlines are competing in a Stackelberg kind of way, right? One firm makes a decision, and then other firms follow. Where are we seeing that today? Just in case you don't believe what I'm saying, I think here it was. It sounds like I'm really picking on the airlines here, but I'm not. I don't really actually care. Delta just increased its baggage fee. And as we can see here, just with this title here, Delta hiked its checked baggage fee 17% after American and United did the same. So the idea here is that one firm decided something first, and then others seem to follow, which then again makes Southwest Airlines a little bit different because they're not charging baggage fees at all, right? So they're, I guess that competition in that case, right, is what makes the market at least interesting here. And then obviously all efforts would be made to avoid collusion in any kind of way. So we had Cournot equilibrium, we had Stackelberg or first mover advantage, and then we've got the Bertrand equilibrium. So now with Bertrand equilibrium, the firms could be making an identical product or not. But now what we're looking at are, instead of looking at things in terms of quantities, we're looking at things in terms of prices. And so what we are doing here is a very different method here. We're still setting marginal revenue equal to marginal cost for each firm, but instead we're looking at this in terms of prices rather than quantities. This will become a little bit more clear again once we get through the problems. But now what we would see here is that our XY axis now, rather than it being the two quantities, now it's going to be the prices charged by each firm. And like before, we're going to be setting these two reaction functions equal to each other. Same rules though. These firms are going to be setting their price equal to their marginal cost, but the difference is that we're generally going to see in a Nash-Bertrand equilibrium that the price is going to equal the marginal cost such that they don't earn any profits. Whereas under the Cournot equilibrium, we were looking at the Lerner index and seeing how much of a price they could charge that was above the marginal cost. We're not going to see that anymore with the Bertrand equilibrium. And it is a bit, it's something that we look at a little bit more. And the reason why we look at this a little bit more is that because sometimes the products that are being sold are homogeneous, they're not very different from one another. And we see that the prices are set pretty darn close um, to the marginal cost. And again, we get these reaction functions that look like this, but still the equilibrium is where those two reaction functions or best response functions would be equal to each other, telling us what the price should be. But we already know that should be very darn close, if not equal to their marginal cost. Okay, so that kind of ends our discussion of oligopolies. In only a few slides, they start to look at things for monopolistic competition. And under monopolistic competition, the big difference here is that we don't have any barriers to entry. So we do have more free entry and exit. And so what we see is that with this greater level of competition, that prices are going to be lower than if they were monopolistic, but they're going to be somewhat higher than they were if they're perfectly competitive. And the reason why is because under monopolistic competition, there's enough of a difference in the products such that they do face, even if they're selling the exact identical product, there's a little bit of market power that exists, which means that for each firm, it does face not a horizontal demand curve, but rather a somewhat slightly downward sloping demand curve. And what we see here is that firms can earn some level of profit, and that profit then would cause other firms to enter the market, such that in the long run, firms won't earn any profit, but that would be a very long time away. But same rule, MR still equals MC. And the way that this picture then looks is that this is for the individual monopolistically competitive firm. You'll see that the demand curve is downward sloping. The marginal revenue curve is steeper. And what you can see is that I'm no longer at the lowest portion of the average cost curve. In the long run, I am earning zero profit, and my costs are a little bit higher. Now, what that means is that we pay for the diversity of the products we have, right? If I want to get vitamins, for instance, we've got like the big producer out there, one a day, but then we could have other firms out there that are also producing vitamins, right? And the things that are in vitamins aren't like exclusive products, right? It's like vitamin C and calcium and all these other kinds of things that any firm can buy off the shelf and put into a pill. But yet, right, one a day is going to do its advertising, it's going to do its things to make its vitamin seem better and different than the others, and its costs are going to be higher. Now, nothing stops me, Scheiding, from entering the vitamin market. So if one a day, the vitamin company is making money, I'm going to, right, enter this market, and I'm going to try to disrupt the market and try to get some of that market share myself. And we're kind of seeing that to move away from this example of vitamins. We're kind of seeing this in the electric car industry, right? Tesla led the market that way, but now, right, we see all the major auto manufacturers offering electric cars in some way. And we'll look at this here in a little bit here. So I'm just going to skip over this for right now. What we generally would see is that each of these firms that exist in this monopolistically competitive market, if there's quite a few of them, then what we would see is that we might be the more firms that there are, the higher the average costs are going to be, and what we would also see is that that greater diversity of products would be something that we could say again is the cost of having um, competition within the firms, among the firms. So finally, what we get to here, right? Oh, sorry, and before we get to that, so we can see this here is that as we get more firms, the costs are um, getting higher, but also that the profits are getting lower. The profits are lowered because now each firm is going to have a smaller share of the market. So the demand curve shifts in for each individual firm as more firms exist. So you would think, well, this would be at least justification for why the government did not allow JetBlue to buy Spirit Airlines, and why there's quite a few people out there who believe that the government will not allow Alaska Airlines to buy Hawaiian Airlines. I don't really know. Okay. That about does it. There's a few more slides here, but these response functions and even just the maths of this all will become a little bit more obvious when I focus on it in that separate video.